Back in 2021, I took on the task of restoring my Macintosh Classic to working order, but little did I realize how much of a challenge it would actually become. A lot of time, money, and collaboration was put into this project, and as to be expected, mistakes were made. So let's talk about it, shall we? Now before I get started, I should point out that I already did not one, but 2 episodes on my Macintosh Classic. But these were made at a time when I was trying to find the right formula for my show, so mistakes were kind of expected. All by adjusting the various potentiometers on the back. It's potentiometers, you stupid. But for those who haven't seen them yet, allow me to give you a recap. No pun intended. Many years ago, my dad acquired this Macintosh Classic, along with some peripherals, through a trade in the mid-90s. At the time, it was a happy little machine. In fact, here it is sitting on a shelf, as seen in a photo from 2005. As the years went on though, the system started to have issues, from getting no sound to starting up with a checkerboard pattern. Whenever I would tinker around with this machine as a kid, I would always wait for it to disappear. But by the early 2010s, it stopped working entirely, always getting stuck on the checkerboard pattern every time I turned it on. And it remained that way for quite some time. Fast forward to 2017. Back when I used to volunteer in ministry at a local church, I discovered a surprise in their prop room. That's right, a yellowed but well-kept Macintosh Classic. Curious, I went to test it with a spare power cord, and believe it or not, it actually turned on. Knowing this, I was able to convince the people who owned it to let me borrow the system for a video I did many years ago, which you can still watch over on my website, by the way. Eventually though, I had to return it back to its owners once filming had wrapped. However, I did have plans with this machine, and it involved some simple part swapping. The plan was to take the working parts out of the yellowed unit and put them into my non-working unit. The non-working parts would then go into the yellowed unit. By early 2020, I had laid out those plans to the owners of said computer. However, progress had halted once the pandemic hit. By the following year, once things had relaxed a bit, I was able to get permission to borrow the machine once more, under the condition that I return it as a non-working prop. I was also able to keep the system's original keyboard, the Apple Keyboard 2, as long as I swapped it out with another one. So I gave them my yellowed Apple design keyboard, which I was going to replace anyway with a new one I bought off of eBay. After more than 3 years of planning, the restoration project could finally begin. As mentioned before, it mostly involved part swapping, and it was the first time I had to fully disassemble the system. Twice. This also meant taking out high voltage components, which I took proper precautions on. Thankfully, the process went pretty well, and I was able to get my machine to boot successfully for the first time in years. Before I went any further, however, I had to get the capacitors on the logic board replaced, so I left it to some folks at a local retro computer shop to do just that. Afterwards, I went ahead and wiped the original hard disk, then proceeded to install System 6, its original system software, along with a bunch of games. It was at this point where the first part of the restoration project ended. Since I did that episode, I've received plenty of comments, but I'll only address a couple here. The first one was in regards to the battery-bombed logic board. In my previous episode, I said that it was beyond repair. Well, beyond my repair skills, that is. It is certainly possible to salvage that board with a new battery holder. Heck, Adrian did just that with one of his units, putting in a modern cell battery in place of the original. So looking back, sure, it is technically possible to repair it. I just don't think it's worth my time. The second comment was in regards to the actual board repair itself. One person said that the store, quote, ripped me off, most likely because they replaced the original electrolytic capacitors with brand new ones, rather than the tantalum kind. Now for those who probably don't understand what I'm talking about, electrolytic capacitors use electrolytic fluid to store the capacitance. However, these things have a limited lifespan, and once their lifespan runs out, they begin to leak. This results in the fluid spilling and corroding the board, which could lead to damaged components, sometimes beyond repair. Tantalum capacitors, on the other hand, don't have that issue, as they use metal to store the capacitance, and therefore are considered more reliable. In hindsight, I really shouldn't blame the store for this. I got the repair I asked for. At the time, I wasn't even aware of the long-term effect of using tantalum capacitors, until I came across a Macintosh Librarian video on the subject, after the repair had been done. So yeah, looking back, I kinda regret not requesting this specifically to the repair guys. But hey, you live and learn. So up to that point, my Macintosh Classic was working pretty well. Until it didn't. It started checkerboarding not too long after, and no amount of cleaning the logic board would resurrect it. My initial thought was the corrosion from the old caps was so bad that it took a toll on this board. Little did I realize how wrong I was. But before I get to that, it's time to move on to the peripherals. I said in a previous episode that I would restore them at a future date. Well, that date is finally here. So the first two peripherals I'll be restoring are these two Apple Desktop Bus mice. Both are pretty yellowed, but the second one arguably looks even worse. So the first thing I did was to disassemble them, but not before removing their balls. Wow, that sounded incredibly weird out of context. The second mouse was a bit more difficult to take apart, as the screws were hidden underneath the bottom label. Eventually, though, I was able to get both of them out. After disassembly, I immediately started cleaning the plastics. One of my go-to solutions is isopropyl alcohol. Normally, I would recommend using it if there's any marker residue on it. Otherwise, an all-purpose cleaner should work fine. Once that was done, it was time to move on to the next part of the restoration, the Retrobrite. Now, for those who don't regularly watch the 8-Bit Guy, like I do, Retrobrite is essentially a process of de-yellowing plastic, typically involving the use of hydrogen peroxide and a source of UV light, in this case, the sun. One of the most common methods is by submerging it in a liquid peroxide solution, which is what I'll be attempting for this restoration. Now, I have attempted to Retrobrite in the past with an Apple Pro keyboard. However, I used 3% peroxide, which is pretty common in many supermarkets and pharmacies. For this project, I decided to use the 40-volume Developer Clear that I purchased from a local Sally Beauty store. That one has 12% peroxide, which means it should work better, especially when mixed in with water. However, it is also far more dangerous to the skin, so it's best to wear some gloves and safety goggles whenever you work with it. For the peripheral restoration, I bought 4 bottles of this solution, one as an extra just in case I run out of the first 3. I took the 2 top pieces of the mice and submerged them in the peroxide, mixed with water in a glass bowl, and enclosed in a plastic bag to help with the greenhouse effect. For the bottom 2 pieces, I placed them in a plastic bag and poured the same amount in there. Then I left them out on the patio table to soak in the sun for an entire day. While that's going on, I turn my attention to the Apple keyboard too. It too is pretty yellowed and a little dirty, so I'll need to take this one apart as well. It's also missing a couple pieces, but I'm not entirely concerned about that. Taking off the keys was pretty straightforward. Since I don't have a proper key puller, a small flat tip will do the trick. I started out with the small keys before heading over to the big keys. Oh, and let's not forget about those rubber springs, whatever those are. Next, I put the keys in another glass bowl, and I also made sure to take the metal wires off of the bigger keys. Then I continued on with the rest of the keyboard disassembly. Obviously, the power button is going to have to go in with the rest of the keys. After disconnecting the keyboard assembly from the controller board, you can see how pretty dirty it is. Next, I got to work washing the keys off with some soap and water. After that was taken care of, I took the time to clean up the keyboard assembly. The usual multi-surface cleaner with a toothbrush should do the trick. So here's what the keyboard assembly looks like after several minutes of cleaning. I left the numpad side on the right alone for comparison. And now here's that part all cleaned up. Next, I soaked the keyboard body pieces with the garden hose. Afterwards, I then scrubbed them with some alcohol and a magic eraser. After some more cleaning and drying, they were ready for the next step. But first, time to check up on those mice. They've been already left out in the sun for several hours, and upon first examination, I can already see a huge difference. However, upon closer inspection, 3 of the 4 mice pieces weren't quite done, and I ran out of sunlight on the patio table, so I had to move them over to direct sunlight by placing them on a stool. Unfortunately, I ran out of sunlight just a couple hours later, so I had to bring them back in. After rinsing out the peroxide, here's how they came out. The bottom piece of the second mouse looks pretty good. The top piece, however, is a different story. It had clearly floated to the surface for the majority of the day, causing it to leave a large circular spot in the middle. I'll definitely need to bring this one back out. As for the first mouse, the top piece looks pretty good. The bottom piece is also looking good. However, I did notice a little color mismatch on the sides, most likely because I didn't submerge it all the way. So that will also have to go back out. Moving on to the next day, I decided to start early with this one. For this experiment, I tried out hot water mixed with peroxide in a clear bin, hoping that it will speed up the process. So in goes the keyboard and unfinished mice. And in goes a whole bottle of peroxide. After one final check to make sure everything is submerged, the keys went outside on the patio table. I made sure to check in on both every half an hour or so. After about several hours, it was starting to get cloudy near the end. However, I was hoping for the best results. After examining the mice, it was time to clean up the keyboard pieces. Already I can see a drastic change compared to before. As for the mice, the bottom piece of the first one has improved. However, there's still a noticeable streak on one side, so I'll have to put it back out once more. The top piece, however, looks great, so there's no need to give it any more treatment. The top piece of the second mouse has also noticeably improved, but there's still that slightly discolored spot in the middle, which doesn't surprise me given the fact that this was the most troublesome piece to keep underwater. What I failed to realize, however, was that the mouse button is held together with plastic tabs. So what I could have done was submerge both pieces separately, thus potentially avoiding the issue of it floating to the top. As mentioned before, the keyboard looks immaculate. And so do the keys, which I was concerned about initially due to shadows potentially covering the sunlight. But after looking through each key and drying them up, they all seem to have gotten the same treatment. And they too look really good. So after letting the pieces dry overnight, it was time to reassemble the keyboard. The ribbon cable was a bit finicky to put back on, but eventually I did get it on tight, whilst trying my best not to damage it. Before I get to the keys, I should put the rubber cups on the switches first. Then I'll have to reattach the metal wires to the larger keys. And now comes the fun part, putting the keys back on. Now before I start the whole process, I did get a photo of the keyboard, just so I can make sure I'm not putting them on wrong. There's just something satisfying about putting keys back on a keyboard. After putting in the larger keys last, I reattached the power key back to the top piece, before finishing up the reassembly. For the record, here's what the keyboard looked like before, and here's what it looks like after. So now it was time to test it. I pulled out my newly acquired ADB cable, along with my iMate ADB to USB adapter, so I could test it with my PC. I tested out all of the keys, and they seem to work just fine, so I'm gonna call this one a win. Okay, so I just put the bottom piece of the desktop bus mouse back out there and left it soaking in peroxide for the day. And I am noticing some improvements on the side. The right side looks really good, but the left side was probably the worst one. You could barely make this out, but there's a little streak right there that I can see. But for the most part, if you turn it at an angle and stuff, it's barely noticeable or not even noticeable at all. So I'm just going to declare this done. So anyways, time to reassemble. I put the second mouse back together first, since the retrobriting on that was already finished. It was a bit difficult getting certain parts to click into place, but after that it was smooth sailing. And now to reassemble the first mouse. Compared to the second one, it's a simple breeze to put back together. And of course, we can't forget about them balls. Again, that didn't really sound right.
Moving right along. That must be why we're not shipping Windows 98 yet. Absolutely.
The last thing to do now was to clean up the gunk on the wire. A simple paper towel with alcohol should do the trick. I also took the time to clean the connector. So here's what the first mouse looked like before. And here's what it looks like after. The same can be said for the second mouse. It doesn't look perfect, but considering how it looked before, I'll take it as a massive improvement. Finally, I tested both mice out with my PC, and of course, they work just fine. So with those out of the way, it was time to move on to the external 800K floppy disk drive. This one is also pretty yellowed, and it's got a minor crack on the front. The cable is also pretty dirty, and there's a couple of missing pieces at the bottom. Before I get to the disassembly, I removed the rubber feet, which I'll have to glue back on at the end. Disassembly was pretty straightforward. I'll have to remove the eject button and the activity light from the bottom piece. Next, I'll remove the bezel from the floppy port. It doesn't look yellowed, but I'll still retrobrite it for good measure. Finally, I disconnected the cable from the board. The first thing I did was blow some dust off of the metal casing with an air compressor. Then I did something kind of stupid. I wanted to test the floppy drive mechanism out. However, the disk wouldn't budge. I later discovered that unlike many floppy drives I've used, this one only works if you have power through it. But since I don't have a working Mac Classic at the moment, putting a disk in is pretty much impossible. So after that pointless attempt, I continued cleaning the rest of the drive. I used a multi-purpose cleaner to wipe any crud off the case pieces. To get into the vent holes, I used a toothbrush and just went to town scrubbing. Next, I used some alcohol to get any excess markings off the surfaces. And as you can see, the top piece looks nice and clean. I did the same techniques for the bottom piece. The port bezel doesn't look too bad, but I decided to clean it anyway. Now to take care of the residue at the bottom. I decided to use some alcohol and a flat-tip screwdriver to scrape out any of the excess glue where the feet would go. In hindsight, I should have used something like WD-40, but at the time I did this, I just picked whatever was closest to me. Plus, it did do the job as I expected. After some more cleaning, the bottom piece was ready to go. Finally, I went ahead and cleaned the cable and its connector, again using alcohol, a paper towel, and a toothbrush. On the next warm and sunny day, it was time to retrobrite. I used the same large bin filled with hot water, just like I did for the keyboard and mice. And in goes the case pieces. I also decided to submerge the eject button, since it too was pretty badly yellowed. Don't worry, putting it in water won't damage it. After struggling with positioning the pieces, I was ready to pour the peroxide in. This is the third bottle I've used for this restoration. As always, I'll check back on them every 30 minutes. After several hours, the sun was starting to set, so it was time to take the pieces out. Already I can see some massive improvements. After rinsing and drying them out, here are the finished results. Just like with the keyboard, they look immaculate. In fact, it looks like they just came out of the factory, if it weren't for the small crack on the front. The eject button also looks better. So now it was time to reassemble the drive, which is basically the reverse of taking it apart. For the screws, I've decided to replace the existing ones with a different set, this time making sure I have all 4. For the feet, I've decided to glue them on with your typical Elmer's glue stick. It's probably not the best option, but I didn't really have any other choice at the time, plus I've had some success with it before. Since I'm missing the 4th foot, I've decided to stick the last one in the center. Hopefully that should keep it in place. So for comparison, here's the external floppy drive from before. And here it is after. Obviously, it looks 10 times better, but I can't do anything with it at the moment, as I don't have a functioning system to test this with. Speaking of which, it's time to head back to the logic board. As mentioned before, I had no way of inspecting this beyond my repair skills, so I had to leave it up to an expert. I got in contact with my buddy Steve from Mac84, who also runs his own YouTube channel. I got to talking with him about my issue, and he agreed to take a look at my logic board. So after I finished up the peripheral restorations, I packed my board up and took it with me to Vintage Computer Festival Midwest 2022, where Steve would pick it up. Now for those living under a rock, Vintage Computer Festival Midwest is a convention dedicated to everything retro computers, normally located in the Chicago area. My first trip there was in 2021, when I got my first Commodore systems and my Apple IIe, the latter of which I did a whole episode on. Anyways, so after Steve got his hands on the logic board, several months would go by without any progress, and during that time I was working on other episodes for my show. But finally, in May of 2023, 8 months later, Steve was finally able to look at my logic board during a live stream. The first thing he asked me was if I tested the board out in another chassis with a different power supply.
Have you ever tested this in another chassis?
The problem was, I didn't have another working system to go by, and on top of that, the logic board worked perfectly fine before I started the whole thing. So he tested it with his Macintosh Performa 200 chassis, and it worked flawlessly. It booted up perfectly fine, everything was checking out, even the reset button worked. So the logic board passed with flying colors, which is a good sign. But upon closer inspection, he did discover some old crud, some leftover solder, and a few cracked solder joints underneath. But those were extremely minor compared to the real problem that was plaguing my system. This understandably left me perplexed. Why did the logic board work on his end, but not on my end? Then it hit me. Remember those jiggly patterns I was having whenever there was hard drive or mouse activity? The power supply may have something to do with it. It may also explain why my unit would only boot whenever it felt like it, and my viewers were also suggesting the same thing. So I decided to take a deeper dive, and pulled out my multimeter. The most ironic thing about this is that I have used it before to diagnose a PS3 power supply. Why didn't I use my multimeter for my Mac Classic earlier? Well, you can blame me for that. Unfortunately, I couldn't get any footage of this, but I was able to find the pinouts of the power supply connector online, and after finding the right pins, I managed to get these initial readings. The 12-volt rail was reporting 10.75 volts, while the 5-volt rails were reporting approximately 4.5 volts, and the negative 12-volt rail was reporting negative 11.33. So that explains why my system wasn't working properly, because it wasn't getting enough friggin' voltage. Now, before testing this, I didn't think the power supply was the problem because, well, I didn't want to take a risk with high voltage components. But now it looks like I'm going to have to overcome this again if I'm ever going to finish this project. I was recommended a video by Branch's Creations on how to adjust the voltage on the analog board. On the Classic, you'll need to access a potentiometer that's inside the machine, rather than on the outside like in the earlier models. So that means a long screwdriver is needed. Since I didn't have the proper tool for this, I decided to jury-rig this long screwdriver together. And thankfully, I was able to turn the potentiometer in a clockwise direction without any problem. Afterwards, I went back to measure the voltage, turned the machine back on, and boom, I was able to get it at the right voltage. But then about 15 minutes later, I tested it again, and the voltage suddenly dropped to 10.5 volts on the 12-volt rail, and 4.2 on the 5-volt rails, which was obviously not enough to keep the hard drive running. But after about another 15 minutes, I turned the system back on, and it was working fine again. So what's basically happening here is the analog board is fluctuating, most likely due to faulty capacitors, which I also found out are notorious for failing, much like the logic board. On the plus side, I can finally rule out the logic board being at fault. But now my attention would shift to the analog board, which means I'll have to take this machine back apart. So as usual, when you work with high voltage, you want to make sure you discharge the CRT here, so I'm going to have to do this process like I did in the past. I know these things automatically discharge when powered off, but I'm not taking a risk here. After taking out the anode cap, I continued onward with the rest of the disassembly, whilst being careful not to accidentally damage the CRT. I did notice a bit of corrosion on one side of the chassis, which I was somewhat aware of when I first did the part swap. Before I go any further, let's take a brief look at the analog board. This is what powers both the computer and the display. Looking at it from this angle, we can observe a few things. At the top is the flyback transformer, which powers the CRT through the anode cap. Left of it is the connector for the deflection yoke, which is essentially a set of coils that surround the rear of the tube, and when powered on, produces a magnetic field that deflects a beam of electrons, thus creating a picture. Below that are some soldered wires that go to the neck board, which control the electron beams that generate the image. To cut down on costs, the neck board was manufactured as part of the main analog board, which was then snapped out and then wired back to the board during manufacturing. There's also a soldered black wire going from the neck board to one part of the CRT for ground. The other set of soldered wires go directly to the logic board. Finally, you've got two other connectors, a 4-pin connector for the hard disk and a small 2-pin connector for the fan. But the main focus here are the capacitors, which are not only showing signs of leakage, but they're also incredibly dusty. So the next thing to do was to take the protective cover off the back of the board. The pins are surprisingly easy to take out, thanks to a flat tip. After taking the last pin out, I removed the cover, revealing the underside of the board. Oh my gosh! Oh, no wonder why it wasn't working right. Wow! Yep, that is clearly capacitor juice that has probably been leaking for quite some time. After inspecting this mess for a few minutes, I knew I had to give it the alcohol treatment. And while I'm at it, I might as well clean the underside of the protective cover too. I spent about half an hour just cleaning the analog board alone. And while it does look better, it's still pretty bad. Thankfully, a lot of the damage was cosmetic, but it's pretty clear at this point that the caps need to be replaced before things get worse. Now, since I lack proper soldering skills at the moment, I decided to get in contact with a guy who actually can do these kind of repairs. Amiga of Rochester. After some back and forth over email, I shipped the board over to him for a recap, which I would then pick up during the next Vintage Computer Festival Midwest. Okay, so I finally got the board back in my hands, but before I do put it back in the system, I should probably put a battery in there. I guess this'll do. Well, that was a bad idea. Jokes aside, I decided not to put a battery in there for the time being, and just put some spares in a small bag. I put the logic board and its memory expansion card back inside the machine, just so I don't forget about it when I bring it over to Chicago. Speaking of which, it's time to head back to VCF Midwest. So this is Thomas of Amiga of Rochester. He does a lot of repair stuff, right?
Yes.
I took the analog board over to this guy for my Mac Classic Restoration project. Tell us what you do here in this table. We got a mess going on here.
So we generally do board level restoration, so capacitors, trace damage, figuring out why something doesn't work. So I mean, that's the long and short of it, and we've been doing it for about 5 years, give or take. This is our second VCF showing. We were at East earlier this year. Over the last 3 days, we've restored about 5 Macintoshes from a non-functioning state, some pretty rare like Macintosh TVs, color classics. We restored a FC30. I'm finishing that up here. We fixed a Nintendo, so we do everything. You know, a circuit's a circuit long term. We really enjoy the turnout. A lot of people come by, talk to us and kind of pick our brain. And we've been able to help a few vendors out with parts and whatnot. So it's been a really good show out.
Definitely interesting to say the least. I don't think I have like half of the repair skill that you've got. So it's nice to see that we got people here like you to save these old computers from death's gate. Thank you very much.
Not a problem, thank you.
Okay, so I got the analog board back, and you can see right here, the capacitors have been replaced, and looks much better now than it did before. Now it's time to put it back into this machine and see what happens. So let's get the board back in. Okay, so I got the analog board back in, and I have someone holding it for me here, so
Hi.
There's that. Yeah, how you doing? So I got that stuff taken care of. We're going to test out the voltage before I put the logic board back in. So here we go. This is the first power on test of the new recapped analog board. So, ready?
Go. I'm getting that
And it
12
looks
volts.
like it is reading 12 volts. Well, about 12 volts.
11.6
but,
is probably fine for a 12
yeah, that should be
volt rail.
okay. Yeah, it looks like it's working. So yeah, I think we're good. Okay, so I got it put back together here, and I got some people surrounding me here. Hey, Adrian, and that's Thomas of Amiga of Rochester. So here we go. This is one for the books.
My watch
It's
buzzed as soon
alive!
as that turned on.
I've never seen somebody so shaken that they're being backwards.
I'm excited about it. Yay! Happy Mac.
It worked before, but the problem was the CRT was jiggling quite a bit, and I now know why. So
Bad caps.
Those are all very high quality caps.
thank God. All right, let's put the whole thing back together. Okay, so I got the system put back together. I also brought the keyboard and mouse and the external floppy drive. I'll be testing this out. And yes, I did bring all my tools with me. All right, let's turn the computer back on. I'm assuming it chimed. The hard drive in this thing actually still works.
That's impressive.
It's a, I think it's a Connor hard drive. Before I go any further, I should probably test out the reset button because it wasn't working before this repair. So let's see what happens. Yep, it works. So yeah, it was definitely an analog board problem the whole time. And so now the machine is fully functional. So now I got to test out the external floppy disk drive, and I know the perfect disk for that occasion, the first version of After Dark, so let's see what happens. Looks like it's reading, and there it is. the first version of After Dark. This external disk drive only reads 800K disks. It won't read 1.44 megabyte. But yeah, it looks like everything's working here. I think it only makes sense that I test out one of the screensavers. So let's do the life screensaver. So I'll just drag this over here. All right, there we go. And now we take out the disk. So let's do that. And there we go. Let me just throw this in the trash here. There we go. All right, I think we're all set to go. So this Macintosh Classic restoration project is now officially complete. Took me a long time to finish it, but heck yeah, let's shut it down now. And there you have it. Oh my goodness. Oh. Whew. Guess I partied myself out so much I must have caught something that put me to sleep. I don't remember what happened after that. Anyways, as you all know by now, my Macintosh Classic is working properly again. All of the issues that were previously present have now been resolved. Even the reset button works now. Before I do wrap up this episode, yes, I did forget to show you the life screensaver in action. This was one of the original modules included with the first version of After Dark, and is often considered one of the lost modules. Well, here it is running on real hardware, and it works pretty good. Unlike the later editions, this one creates a game of life through a selected portion of the desktop, rather than have it randomly generated in a black background. It's honestly pretty cool from a technical standpoint. And of course, we can't end this without some harmless trolling involved. And so we have reached the conclusion of what has been quite possibly my most ambitious restoration project I have ever undertaken. It took 4 years of planning and 2 years of work with a collaborative effort by the tech community to make this all possible. And after all that, I'm still going to stick to my original recommendation. If you're planning on getting into vintage Mac collecting, I would suggest getting something like a Power Mac G4. These old beige systems have a wide variety of problems that are just simply too costly and time-consuming to fix. But it's not like I didn't learn anything from this experience. Sure, I did make several mistakes that cost me time, but that learning curve should help me out when repairing computers like this in the future, especially when it's something like a Macintosh Classic. Now, there are some upgrades I plan on doing with this system in the future. If and when the original hard drive inevitably fails, I will most likely get it replaced with a blue SCSI, which I acquired for one of my other vintage Macs I own. The creators just released a second version powered by a Raspberry Pi Pico, which offers some pretty cool capabilities like built-in wireless. So it is possible to connect these things to the internet. But again, I'll only do that if and when the original hard disk fails, which, as of right now, doesn't seem to be the case. But anyways, I want to give a huge shout out to everyone involved, especially Steve from Mac84 and Thomas from Amiga of Rochester for helping me finish this years-long project. None of this would have been possible without their help. And with that said, I think it's time for me to move on. Thank you all for being part of this journey, and as always, I will see you all next time. Take care. Huh, I didn't know my system could do that. Oh well, I'm just glad it's over. Onward to more retrospectives and beyond!